News now in Moscow. This week, a Syria truce is on the table, but not everyone wants to sit down. Refugees are still knocking on Europe's door, and Hitler's medical records reveal his true size. You're in the now. Russia and the U.S. finally agreed on something, a ceasefire in Syria. I mean, they probably both have a plan B, let's be honest. This plan, though, excludes ISIS and other terrorist groups, so why not give it a chance? But not everyone is liking it. Yes, Assad was like, sure, I'll give it a try. Rebels were like, if he stops, we'll stop. Iran and Saudi Arabia were like, well, you can try. Britain was like, but if it fails, Russia and Assad are to blame. Turkey was like, yeah, it's gonna fail. And the media, well, they always have something nice to say.
There's a lot of skepticism about the proposed truce.
It's a very weak one.
Whether they can even get this going is the bigger question.
Very little optimism. There have been so many attempts at peace over the last few years.
We've certainly seen failed ceasefire plans already before.
Joining me now is John B. Alterman, Senior Vice President, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy and Director of Mideast Program in Moscow this week for a Mideast conference. Thanks so much for joining us. Syria, of course, is the first thing I want to ask you about. The U.S.-Russia deal on a partial truce in Syria raised more doubt than optimism. This is New York Times headline just after the deal. Doubt or optimism? What's your feelings?
I'm doubtful, honestly, because what it means is that there's a cessation of violence between government forces. I'm not sure it means that there's any agreement between the United States and Russia on who will still be allowable to attack. There's been persistent disagreement between the U.S. and Russia on who the proper targets of attack are. And I'm quite concerned that what is going to happen is we'll continue to be differing, we'll continue to not get toward a negotiated solution to this conflict, and the fighting will just continue.
But the U.S. and Russia, as two powers with lots of interest in the region, have to do something. They can't just sit back and let it unravel more, yes? I mean, there's so much pessimism about this deal from the UK as well. In a matter of hours, they issued a statement saying it will not work until there's a major change of behavior from Assad and Russia, basically saying, and this is my interpretation, of course, that the responsibility lies with them. So what responsibility does the U.S. have in this deal?
Look, the U.S. has been very, very targeted in its military strikes. The U.S. has only been targeting Islamic State targets. About 30% of Russian attacks are against Islamic State targets. 70% of Russian attacks are against other targets, whether it's Jabhat al-Nusra or other groups, including groups that the United States has been supporting. And where I think we are is without a real agreement on what the desired outcome is. The United States, as far as I can tell, is pushing toward an agreement that leads to an inclusive settlement. And Russia is pushing toward an agreement where the government of Syria is the dominant power in the future of Syria. The concern on the U.S. side is that doesn't lead you toward resolving the conflict, it leads you toward an ongoing war. The concern on the Russian side is that the U.S. process doesn't resolve things, it continues this chaos in Syria because you need a strong government to impose control. I'm not convinced that there's yet been U.S.-Russian agreement on what we're really trying to do. And I fear that what Russia has been doing and will be doing after this agreement is continuing to fight against a whole range of opposition groups. So the only alternative is the Islamic State or the Assad government. And the world decides we're better off with the Assad government. The strong view in the United States among people I talk to is that the Assad government isn't a viable solution going forward either, that there has to be a new form of government. I'm not sure Russia has really come around to that point of view.
You talked about al-Nusra and other groups on the ground. I mean, these are groups that a lot of organizations around the world have deemed terrorists. So why would Russia be criticized for striking them?
Well, certainly the Nusra Front is the Syrian wing of al-Qaeda.
Is that not enough to target them?
But there are many other groups who Russia has been targeting, which are not Nusra. They are fighting with Nusra against the Syrian government.
How do you tell? This is a good point, because many would argue that what got us into this mess and what allowed for ISIS to really gain territory in Syria was this idea that there are moderate rebel groups and some opposition groups, and there are some terrorists in there, and they might, weapons might go back and forth, but what's important here is getting rid of Assad. So how do you, at this point, decide who should be targeted, who should be targeted by Russia or the United States, and who shouldn't?
Look, I would argue that what got us into this mess is you had a proxy war where people felt they were being targeted because of who they are or what they are. That is, Sunni populations felt incredibly vulnerable, and they were looking for anybody to protect them, and then some of the Sunni tribes welcomed in the Islamic State or other groups because they felt they needed protection against the government. And it was the government of Syria which turned against peaceful protesters and turned this into a military confrontation. And it was the government of Syria which has continued to trade oil with the Islamic State. And the government of Syria has been trying to turn this into a two-sided war with the government of Syria on one side and the Islamic State on the other.
So you're claiming that Assad and the Syrian government is working with ISIS?
There is no question that there's no question that the Islamic State is selling oil, is selling other things, that
because
there's
Russia
trade.
claims that Turkey is helping with ISIS oil.
That's also happening. But the government of Syria has tried to turn this into a battle between itself and ISIS out of a hope that the world will consider ISIS totally unpalatable and will decide the government of Syria is more palatable. What I think that has led to is this situation where vulnerable populations feel that they need to side with somebody against this government, and they'll side with anybody. And you have all these different alliances going back and forth, and people switch groups back and forth. But the U.S. concern, I think it's a legitimate concern, not just saying because I'm an American. I think it's a real concern that there are too many Syrians. Millions and millions of Syrians feel they can have no future in their own country if Bashar al-Assad is in power.
I'm pretty sure millions of Syrians would say that their life in Syria was a lot better before a whole bunch of countries started a proxy war there and allowed for terror to grow. What about those Syrians?
And part of the question is, why was this militarized? And there's no question in my mind, as somebody who's been watching this for a long time, it was militarized because the Assad government decided in Daraa and other places to militarize.
So the only interests in Syria are with Assad. Russia, the United States, Saudi Arabia have no interest that might not be seen at the top.
The reason this became militarized initially is because Bashar al-Assad decided to militarize it. I can't speak for what Russian interests are. I've heard any number of descriptions of Russian interests. Some people say they're trying to protect their naval base at Tartus. Other people say that Russia has a global view, that it's trying to stop colored revolutions around the world, and it's going to stop one in Syria, and it's going to spill over to everything happening everywhere else. There is no question in my mind that every place in the Middle East where you have proxy wars, you also have ISIS. Every place you have proxy wars, you have ISIS, and the endurance of these proxy wars means the endurance of ISIS, which affects Russian security and European security much more than it affects American security. But I think it's in the interest of Russia and the interest of the United States to end the proxy war. Then the question becomes, what kind of deal do you have at the end of the day? Is it a deal which essentially leaves something very much like the current Syrian government intact? And my view is that won't be durable, that won't be sustainable for millions of Syrians who think this is a murderous government that will not allow them to pursue their livelihoods. Or do you have some sort of process that leads to a different kind of government, whether the government of Russia, the government of Iran, the government of Syria is willing to go down that path is unclear, but I don't think there's another path to resolving the broader issues.
What about the lessons we learned from Libya? Again, a murderous dictator taken down. The country seems a lot worse and a lot more chaos than it was before NATO involvement in Libya. Should we not learn from those lessons, or do you think it's a completely different case?
No, not only do I think we should learn from Libya, but I would argue that it's U.S. allies who are on either side of this proxy war in Libya giving rise to ISIS. So I think we have to be much more serious about Libya. I think we have to be more serious about Syria. I think we have to be serious about moving toward a resolution in Yemen and Iraq and other places. Because every place there is a proxy war, you do have ISIS. I think it is tremendously regionally destabilizing. It's destabilizing for Europe, and it's going to be destabilizing for Russia. It's not a coincidence that there are lots of Chechens fighting in Syria, and the idea this isn't going to spill back into Russia, I think, is a mistake.
Do you think that the terrorist threat to Russia, you mentioned, I think one of the highest numbers of ISIS recruits are actually terrorists with Russian passports, that threat to Russia is underestimated in the West? That Russia has made fighting ISIS and fighting terrorism, the spill out from Syria, how important it is to Russia. Do you think it's understood in America so far away?
I think it's understood. I think there are some countries who think that it's good to get your terrorists fighting somewhere else so somebody else can kill them, right? And certainly one of the things, I had a conversation with Bashar al-Assad about 8 years ago in his office.
This is interesting.
No, and he was gleeful that the jihadis from Syria were going to fight Americans in Iraq. And he said, if you want me to stop it, you have to give me something for it. But I'm not going to stop it on my own. And from the Syrian perspective, this was great because jihadis leaving Syria and fighting in Iraq, A, gave him a bargaining chip with the United States, and B, the Americans were killing his jihadis for him.
But clearly, Bashar al-Assad is not...
Did that work out for Bashar al-Assad? No, it came right back. It came right back.
But he clearly is not the only leader or country in the world that's going to use bargaining chips and push their interests.
That's not the interest. That's not the point. The point is, when you start playing games with allowing jihadis to go and figuring something else will kill the jihadis, playing a game instrumentally using jihadis to pursue your interests, it seems to me has backfired on every single country that's done it. And what we have to do is we have to change a political context that dries up the local support for ISIS in all these places. And that requires a political deal, and it requires Russia to agree with Iran, to agree with Turkey, to agree with all the others, Saudi Arabia and others, to end this conflict on terms that represent not a return to the status quo ante, but some sort of deal where all the Syrians who have had their homes destroyed, been forced from their homes, who have watched their families been killed, say, you know what, it might not be perfect, but at least I have a future here. And millions of Syrians say there is no future at all in this country as long as Bashar al-Assad or anybody in his family or anybody connected to this murderous war is going to be in power.
I think that the people should be asked this, no? That the people should be speaking this, not the American government. I think that there's probably a lot of people in Syria that would argue that their future has already been taken from them. The country's been completely devastated. The
country's been devastated. It will take billions and billions of dollars and decades to rebuild Syria. And as somebody who's been to Syria several times, who has a lot of Syrian friends, it's hard to overestimate the pain of Syria. This is a country that has not only been destroyed, it will be destroyed for years and years to come.
And I think who's to blame for it will be debated for years to come. I'm going to have to stop it there. John B. Alterman, Senior Vice President, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, also Director of the Middle East Program. Thanks so much for being in the Now.
Thank you.
Coming up after a short break, Hitler had an itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny, you'll have to wait and see. Stay in the Now.
At Luma, we say yes to someone every 6 minutes. So for a response in 60 seconds, go to luma.co.uk today.
Vanish Gold tackles stains in just 30 seconds. But what about tough, dried-in stains? Mud, red wine, gravy, tomato. In just 30 seconds. Let's see. Start the clock. Look at it go. Time's almost up. 29, 30 seconds. Those dried-in stains really have gone. Wow! Vanish Gold. Stains dried in for 7 days, gone in 30 seconds.
More and more women admire their beautiful nails, thanks to the Scholl Velvet Smooth Nail Care System, specially designed for filing, buffing and polishing your toes and fingernails. The easy way to natural-looking, shiny wow nails. Wow. The Scholl Velvet Smooth Nail Care System. And for daily nourishment, use the enriched nail oil from Scholl.
Classes are lethal. Allegedly, they claimed hundreds of victims last year alone, which is why... Stop! I've had to get rid of all the jams!
Life insurance simply done at BeagleStreet.com. Search Beagle Street now.
When it comes to furniture, there's one place I always go, online to the Cotswold Company. It's handmade, you see, so I know it will always be great quality. I just sit back and imagine what it would be like in my home. And should something arrive that I'm not 100% happy with, they'll pick it up completely free of charge. Free delivery and free returns. Amazing. That's why the Cotswold Company is perfect for us.
Discover affordable handmade furniture from the comfort of home. Visit cotswoldcompany.com today.
Have a little break at Butlins by the Sea. Book before Tuesday and you can save up to 15%. Call us or visit butlins.com to find out more.
Welcome back. You're in the Now, and I'm Anissa Nawe. The refugee crisis in Europe is still seeing asylum seekers of all ages knock on Europe's door. Joining me in the Now is Eugenio Ambrosi, Regional Director of International Organization for Migration. Thanks so much for being with us. What is the biggest misconception, as you see it, of this refugee crisis?
Well, I would say that the first misconception is to call it a crisis. Even if the number have increased in terms of refugee and migrants arriving in Europe in 2015 and also in the first 6 weeks of this year, this is still a relatively low number compared to overall mobility in other regions of the world. And it's also a quite low number compared to the overall population and possibilities of Europe to host refugees and migrants. So in our view, this is not really a crisis in terms of arrival. It's a crisis in terms of management and in terms of policy to handle the increased flow and increased pressure that Europe has been witnessing in the last year and a few months.
Because a lot of the European politicians would call this a crisis. Many people do. How can refugees, migrants help the situation? Because they are bearing a big brunt of the blame for this so-called crisis.
Well, neither refugee nor migrants should be blamed for what is happening. Most of these people are running away from wars in the Middle East and in other parts of Africa or North Africa. So they are, first of all, victims of a situation that they have had no part in creating. And so, for sure, they shouldn't be blamed for trying to escape, search for safety, and search for an alternative future for themselves and for their family. The blame eventually is on the cause and on the situation that have generated this increased movement of people for certain regions of the world. And what we should be focusing on is not on blaming refugees or migrants for moving, but on solving the very reason that are pushing these people to try to escape to Europe and other parts of the world.
I agree with you 100%, but if the politicians aren't changing their policies, so to say, in these parts of the world, and European citizens are putting the blame in everyday life on these refugees, how do we solve the problem?
Well, I think a big responsibility lies with all of us, especially those who have public impact, politicians, media, newspaper, TV, civil society groups. And the responsibility lies with us because we have a duty to try to make people understand what is happening, first of all, the reason why these people are fleeing, and also put things in context and show to the population of European countries that what is coming to Europe is by no means unmanageable. I think a lot of the reaction of the public opinion is due to the fact that too many countries are presenting the situation as catastrophic, while instead it would be much easier and much more responsible to show the situation as something that not only Europe can handle, but that Europe has a duty to respond with humanitarian principle and welcoming people that are fleeing wars. After all, 60, 70 years ago, Europeans were doing the same and were searching for safety and for an alternative to their future in other parts of the world. And other parts of the world have welcomed European refugees and European migrants a few years ago. So I think we have a responsibility to do the same to this new wave of migrants and refugees coming on our shores.
It's a very divisive issue. European leaders don't seem to agree on a lot of the issues. They seem split. Are they becoming more and more on one page? And if not, how do centers like yourself, experts like yourself, get them on the same page?
I don't think right now that they are really getting on the same page yet. There are still a lot of discussion and a lot of proposals that are very different among themselves in terms of how to handle the situation. There are countries in Europe that are more prone to open their society and their borders to accept more refugees. There are other countries that are resisting the idea of larger number of people arriving. So I think a good compromise has not been found yet. As far as our role, I'm not sure we have the possibility of changing anybody's mind, but definitely we have the responsibility of expressing not only our idea, but the facts of the situation. And we have responsibility of saying that the refugees arriving in Europe is a very small percentage of the overall refugee population in the world, and therefore that there is not only the responsibility, but the possibility of European countries to accept and to integrate this group of people that are arriving in our countries. Whether or not governments and politicians listen, this is another question. But definitely this is the principle and the ideas that we continue to put forward in this situation.
Should we expect more from non-European countries to help this situation from outside of Europe?
Definitely so, but not just because they should help Europe, but also because they should help the refugees. The number of people that are displaced by war and by violence and also by other situations, be it climate change or extreme poverty, is extremely big. And I think it's the responsibility of the whole international community to respond to this situation by accepting more refugees and more migrants, by increasing resettlement possibility for refugees and ensuring protection of the people that are escaping war or persecution. This is definitely not simply the responsibility of Europe, it's not simply a responsibility of neighboring countries to a crisis region, but it is the responsibility of the overall international community. So every region of the world should do, according to their own possibility, their own part to tackle and assist in handling this current situation.
Eugenio Ambrosi, Regional Director of International Organization for Migration. Thanks so much for being in the Now.
Thank you.
Well, Berlin has opened its first major center for gay and transgender refugees after attacks from other migrants were getting out of hand.
I know, because you are supposed to be protected, but you are under international law and there is little that can be done while you are an asylum seeker. So it's a lot of fear. It's too much for an individual to handle after this long trip.
And in France, animals tortured, burnt alive, and left bleeding. All of that happening at a so-called organic meat farm. Historians and scientists can dig up the darndest things. It turns out there's an explanation for why Hitler was the way he was, or at least part of it.
Adolf says it isn't fair.
That explains everything. And it does it for me this week. Great to have you in the now. Stay in touch online, and I'll see you next Sunday. Till then, it's now or never.